Have you ever worked for someone you trusted so completely that you'd have followed them anywhere? What if, after 30 years of loyalty, that same person destroyed every career in the building, not because the company was failing, but because one secret was about to come out? And if you accidentally became the only person who knew that secret, would you stay silent or risk losing everything to expose the truth? My name is Michael Turner. For 32 years, I believed Richard Collins was the finest businessman I'd ever meet. He gave hundreds of people jobs, paid for employees' medical bills, attended weddings, sent flowers to funerals. Everyone called him a great man, including me, until the morning he walked into the boardroom, looked every employee in the eye, and destroyed every life we'd spent decades building. At the time, I believed he was trying to save himself. I was wrong. He wasn't protecting his company. He was protecting one secret. And by the time I discovered what it really was, there was nothing left for him to save. Have you ever worked for someone you trusted so completely that you believed they'd never betray the people who helped build their success? What if, after 32 years of loyalty, that same person walked into work one ordinary morning and destroyed every career in the building, not because the company was failing, but because one secret was about to come out? And if you unknowingly became the last person standing between that secret and the truth, how far would someone go to keep you quiet? My name is Michael Turner. For most of my adult life, I believed Richard Collins was the kind of boss every employee hoped to work for at least once. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drive exotic cars. He wasn't the sort of CEO who filled magazines with interviews about success. Richard believed in something much simpler. Take care of your people, he'd always say. The business will take care of itself. For 30-2 years. He lived by those words. Or at least, that's what all of us believed. Collins Manufacturing wasn't a giant corporation. It was a family-owned company that made industrial equipment for factories across the Midwest. Nearly 300 employees worked there. Some families had 3 generations under the same roof. Fathers, sons, daughters, husbands and wives. People didn't just work there. They built their lives there. I started when I was 26, fresh out of community college with more determination than experience. Richard hired me himself. He shook my hand, looked me straight in the eye and said, "If you work hard here, you'll never have to worry about feeding your family." 32 years later, he had kept that promise. When my wife needed surgery, the company insurance covered almost everything. When my daughter received a college scholarship, Richard personally congratulated her. When my father passed away, Richard closed the office for 2 hours so employees could attend the funeral. Who wouldn't trust a man like that? I certainly did. Everyone did. That's why none of us saw it coming. It started on a Tuesday. Nothing unusual about the morning. Coffee in the break room. Forklifts moving shipments. Machines humming exactly as they had for decades. The kind of routine that makes you believe tomorrow will look exactly like today. Around 10 o'clock, an email appeared in everyone's inbox. Mandatory company-wide meeting. 11 a.m. Attendance required. People joked about it. Maybe Richard had landed another huge contract. Maybe the company was expanding again. Someone even guessed we'd finally get the retirement plan improvements we'd been requesting for years. Nobody looked worried. Why would they? The company had reported record profits just 3 months earlier. We'd been working overtime to keep up with demand. Business wasn't slowing down. If anything, we couldn't manufacture products fast enough. At exactly 11, nearly 300 employees filled the warehouse floor. Richard stood on the small platform where he usually announced holiday bonuses. Only, something felt different. He wasn't smiling. Neither was the company's attorney standing beside him. That caught my attention. Lawyers didn't usually attend employee celebrations. Richard adjusted the microphone. His hands were shaking. I remember noticing that before I heard a single word. "I'll keep this brief." His voice sounded tired. Older than I'd ever heard it. Effective immediately. Collins Manufacturing is permanently closing. The room went silent. Not confused. Silent. Like 300 people had forgotten how to breathe at exactly the same moment. Someone laughed. Honestly laughed. thinking it had to be a joke. Richard didn't react. I know this is difficult. You'll each receive severance packages. Our attorneys will explain the details. Then, he stepped away from the microphone. That was it. No explanation. No financial presentation. No bankruptcy announcement. Nothing. People immediately started shouting. What happened? We just had record profits. Is this temporary? What about our pensions? What about our insurance? Richard didn't answer a single question. He simply turned and walked toward the office hallway. For 32 years, I'd never seen him walk away from employees asking for answers. Not once. This time, he never looked back. Chaos spread through the warehouse. Some employees cried. Others yelled. One man punched a support beam hard enough to break 2 fingers. A young mother collapsed into a chair after realizing she'd lose the health insurance covering her son's leukemia treatments. Another employee kept repeating the same sentence. My wife starts maternity leave next month. Over and over. As though saying it enough times might somehow change reality. I stood completely still. None of it made sense. Businesses don't shut down after record profits. Not overnight. Not without warning. Not unless something much bigger has happened. Then I noticed something almost nobody else was paying attention to. The accounting department. Every single accountant had disappeared before the meeting ended. Their desks. Already empty. I frowned. That wasn't normal. It wasn't just unusual. It was planned. Carefully planned. Around 2 hours later, I returned to my office to clear out 32 years of my life. Family photographs. Awards. Coffee mug. Old notebooks. The little wooden nameplate my coworkers had given me when I'd celebrated 25 years with the company. Funny how an entire career fits inside one cardboard box. As I opened my bottom desk drawer, something slid onto the floor. A plain white envelope. No stamp. No company logo. Just 3 handwritten words. For Michael only. I stared at it. I'd never seen it before. I looked around the empty office. Everyone else had already left. The building was almost silent now. For some reason. Instead of opening the envelope immediately, I looked toward Richard's office at the end of the hallway. The lights were still on. The door was closed. And standing outside it was the company's attorney. Watching me. Not the hallway. Not the employees. Me. The moment our eyes met, he reached for his phone. And suddenly, for the first time that day, I realized something that had absolutely nothing to do with losing my job. Someone was making sure I didn't open that envelope. There are moments when your instincts speak before your mind has time to catch up. Standing alone in my office, holding that plain white envelope, I couldn't explain why my pulse had suddenly quickened. Nothing about it looked unusual. No company logo. No return address. Just 3 handwritten words. For Michael only. Yet somehow, it felt heavier than a single sheet of paper should. Across the hallway, the company's attorney hadn't moved. He was still standing outside Richard's office. Still pretending to scroll through his phone. Still watching me. The moment I slipped the envelope into my briefcase, he turned and quietly disappeared inside Richard's office. That wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to know whether I'd opened it. And someone else wanted to make sure I didn't. I didn't open it. Not there. Not in that building. For 32 years, I'd solved problems by thinking before acting. That habit had probably saved me more than once. It saved me again that afternoon. I finished packing my office exactly the way everyone else did. Family photographs. Awards. Coffee mug. Retirement plaque. The little plant my secretary insisted I'd kill if she ever retired before me. As I carried the cardboard box through the parking lot, I looked back one last time. Collins Manufacturing. The sign had stood there longer than some of the employees had been alive. Tomorrow, someone would probably begin removing it. Funny how quickly a lifetime becomes yesterday. The drive home felt strangely quiet. Normally, I listened to baseball games or old country music. That afternoon, I drove in complete silence. At every red light, my eyes drifted toward the briefcase sitting on the passenger seat. The envelope remained inside, untouched, waiting. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I still hadn't decided whether I wanted to know what was inside. My wife, Susan, opened the front door before I even reached the porch. One look at my face, and she already knew. "You lost your job." I nodded. She wrapped her arms around me without asking a single question. 34 years of marriage teaches you when words help. And when they don't. We sat together at the kitchen table. I explained everything. The meeting. The shutdown. The severance package. The attorney. She listened quietly until I mentioned the envelope. Her expression changed immediately. "Who gave it to you?" "I don't know. It was in my desk." "For how long?" "I've never seen it before." She looked toward the briefcase. "Have you opened it?" "No." She frowned. "Why not?" "I have a feeling." I hesitated. A feeling about what? That once I read whatever's inside, there's no going back. Susan reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Then maybe that's exactly why you should wait." That night, neither of us slept very much. Around 3 in the morning, I finally gave up pretending. I walked downstairs, poured myself a cup of coffee, and placed the envelope on the dining room table. The house was completely silent. I carefully broke the seal. Inside, there wasn't a letter. There was a flash drive. Nothing else. No instructions. No note. Just a plain black USB drive. I stared at it. Of all the things I'd expected, that wasn't one of them. I carried it into my small home office. My computer hummed to life. For several seconds, I simply held the drive between my fingers. Then, I plugged it in. One folder appeared. Its name was only 2 words. Insurance files. I frowned. Insurance? What did insurance have to do with shutting down an entire company? I opened the folder. Hundreds of documents. Invoices. Emails. Spreadsheets. Medical reports. Employee claim summaries. The dates stretched back almost 15 years. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then one file name caught my attention. Confidential settlement.pdf. I opened it. The document described a workplace accident from almost 12 years earlier. An employee had been seriously injured by defective machinery. The company had reached a confidential settlement. That wasn't strange. Large companies settled claims all the time. But then I noticed something impossible. I knew the employee's name. Tom Henderson. Tom had never left the company. He'd continued working beside me for another decade. According to this document, he'd accepted a permanent disability settlement. Yet somehow, he'd never actually stopped working. I leaned closer to the screen. The signatures looked genuine. The legal paperwork appeared authentic. Everything about it looked official. Except, none of it matched reality. A second folder sat underneath. Employee claims. I clicked it. My stomach tightened. There weren't 1 or 2 settlements. There were dozens. Employees I personally knew. People who had supposedly suffered catastrophic injuries. People who had supposedly retired. People who had supposedly accepted million-dollar settlements. Except, they hadn't. I'd worked beside many of them for years afterward. The documents claimed lives that had never happened. I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. Susan stood quietly in the doorway. "You've been in here almost an hour." I slowly turned the monitor toward her. "Look at this." She spent several minutes reading. Finally, she whispered, "These can't be real." "I know. They have to be fake." "I know." Neither answer made me feel any better. Because if they were fake, someone had created an enormous fraud. And if they were real, then reality itself no longer made sense. The next morning, my phone rang. Unknown number. Normally, I ignored unknown callers. Something told me not to. "Hello." Several seconds passed. Then a familiar voice quietly spoke. "Michael." It was Richard Collins. "I need you to do something for me." I didn't answer. He continued anyway. "Destroy whatever was left in your desk." I looked toward the flash drive still plugged into my computer. My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Because in that single moment, I finally understood something. Richard wasn't asking. He already knew exactly what had been left for me to find. And somehow, he believed I was the only person who still had it. There are two kinds of fear. The first is wondering whether you've uncovered the truth. The second is realizing someone else already knows you have. Richard's phone call echoed in my mind long after I'd hung up. Destroy whatever was left in your desk. He never asked what I'd found. He never asked whether I'd opened it. He already knew, which meant someone had left that flash drive for me on purpose. The only question was, why me? I barely slept. The files I'd seen the night before refused to leave my thoughts. Insurance settlements. Employees I personally knew. Medical claims that didn't match the lives I'd watched those same people continue living. Nothing made sense. Every explanation created two more questions. Susan found me sitting at the kitchen table just before sunrise. You've been staring at that laptop for an hour. I know. You think Richard committed fraud. I looked at the screen. I don't know what I think anymore. She sat across from me. Then don't decide until you know more. That was one of the reasons I'd stayed married to Susan for 34 years. She never rushed me toward conclusions. Around 9:30, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Something made me answer. Michael Turner? Yes. My name is Emily Brooks. I worked in human resources at corporate. That explained why I didn't recognize the name. Our manufacturing plant rarely dealt directly with headquarters. I need to ask you something. I waited. Did you find something in your office yesterday? My silence answered for me. I thought so. How? Because I left it there. Every instinct told me to hang up. Instead, I stood and quietly closed my office door. Why? Because I didn't know who else I could trust. You don't even know me. I know exactly who you are. That answer surprised me. You've worked there 32 years. Every internal audit mentioned your department. Whenever numbers didn't make sense, you were usually the person who found the mistake. I frowned. I've never met you. No, but I've been reading your reports for almost 10 years. We agreed to meet at a small diner 20 miles outside town. Public enough to feel safe. Quiet enough to talk. Emily arrived carrying a single expanding file folder. Nothing dramatic. No mysterious briefcase. No disguises. Just an ordinary office folder. She sat down. Ordered coffee. Waited until the waitress walked away, then she looked directly at me. Before you ask. No. Richard didn't put me up to this. I assumed that. He'd never approve. That caught my attention. You still trust him? She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said. I trust the man he used to be. She slid one document across the table. It wasn't a settlement. It was an internal audit. My eyes immediately recognized the heading. Employee Medical Claims Review. What am I looking at? Page 4. I flipped to the page. Several employee names were highlighted. Tom Henderson. Lisa Moreno. Bill Carter. People I'd worked beside for years. Each file contained unusually large insurance payments. I frowned. I saw these last night. I know. What you didn't see. She handed me another document. Is this? The second report had been prepared 6 months later. The same employees. The same claims. Only, every payment had quietly disappeared. No reimbursement.no accounting entry. No explanation. As though millions of dollars had simply vanished from the company's books. I looked up. That's impossible. It should be. So, where did the money go? Emily slowly shook her head. Nobody knows. She took a sip of coffee before continuing. I've spent the last 18 months trying to trace those payments. Every trail ends the same way. Richard. I stared at her. So he stole the money? I don't know. That's the problem. If he'd stolen it, this investigation would have ended months ago. I leaned forward. What do you mean? She lowered her voice. The money left the company, but it never entered any account connected to Richard. No offshore transfers. No hidden businesses. No personal investments. No luxury purchases. No unexplained assets. She paused. It just disappeared. That answer bothered me more than fraud would have. Because theft has a motive. Disappearance doesn't. So why close? The company. Emily looked around the diner before answering. Because someone outside the company finally started asking where that money went. Who? The insurance carrier. I nodded slowly. Now that made sense. The audit. Worse. A criminal investigation. The waitress arrived with fresh coffee. Neither of us spoke until she'd walked away. Then Emily quietly said, "Yesterday morning, before Richard called the company meeting, 2 investigators arrived with subpoenas." I felt my stomach tighten. They searched accounting. They copied every server. They interviewed 3 executives. And 2 hours later, Richard shut down a company that had just reported record profits. For the first time, the closure actually felt believable. Not because the business was failing, because something had happened that Richard believed would destroy every employee if the investigation continued. I looked at Emily. "Why send me the files?" She smiled sadly. "Because I don't think Richard is hiding what everyone believes he's hiding." The words hung between us. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward one last time. "I think Richard fired everyone because he believes he's the only one who should pay for whatever happened." I frowned. "You think he's protecting himself?" She slowly shook her head. "No. I think he's protecting someone else." At that exact moment, a black sedan pulled quietly into the diner's parking lot. Emily looked through the window. The color drained from her face. She whispered only 4 words. "They found me first." Then she stood up, leaving both the folder and every answer sitting on the table in front of me. There are times when the truth doesn't arrive with a dramatic confession. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary numbers. And if you've spent your entire career working with numbers, you learn something important. Numbers don't lie. People do. Emily disappeared before I could ask another question. A transfer authorization code. Most people would have ignored it. I didn't. The next morning, I called an old friend, Daniel Ross. We'd worked together for almost 25 years before he'd retired from the accounting department. If anyone understood Collins Manufacturing's financial system, it was Daniel. After listening quietly, he finally said, "That transfer code shouldn't exist." "Why?" "Because that's not an insurance code." "What is it?" "It's a trust account." I frowned. "A trust?" "Yes. The company only had one." "What was it for?" Long silence. "I honestly don't know." That answer bothered me. Daniel wasn't a man who forgot details. If he said he didn't know, then he'd never been allowed to know. Who managed it? Only 2 people. Richard and Margaret Ellis. The name meant nothing to me. Who was Margaret? Our company attorney before she retired. Retired. Not the young attorney I'd seen outside Richard's office. Someone else. Someone who had been there long before. Where is she now? I haven't spoken to her in years. Then Daniel said something that made me sit upright. But if Richard trusted anyone, it was Margaret. Within an hour, I'd found an address. Small town. About an hour's drive away. Susan insisted on coming with me. "You've spent 32 years trusting your instincts. I'm trusting mine." Neither of us spoke much during the drive. The closer we got, the less this felt like chasing a conspiracy. It felt like trying to understand an old friend. And somehow, that scared me more. Margaret Ellis lived alone in a modest brick house with an overgrown garden. Nothing about the place suggested wealth. Nothing suggested someone who'd hidden millions. She answered the door herself. Late 70s. Sharp eyes. Steady voice. "Can I help you?" "I'm Michael Turner." Recognition flashed across her face almost instantly. I wondered how long it would take. That wasn't the greeting I'd expected. "You know why I'm here?" By the time I reached the diner's parking lot, the black sedan she'd noticed was already pulling away. I couldn't tell whether it had followed her, or whether she'd simply imagined the danger. Either way, she was gone. Only the folder remained on the table, along with a single sentence that wouldn't leave my mind. "I think Richard believes he's the only one who should pay." Not, "he should pay," but, "he believes he should." There was a difference. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Back home, Susan found me sitting in my office again. The folder lay open across the desk. Bank reports. Insurance reimbursements. Internal audits. Nothing looked extraordinary by itself. But together, they formed a pattern. You've barely spoken since you came home, Susan said. I think I've been looking at the wrong question. She pulled up a chair. What question? I've been asking where the money went. And? I slid one report toward her. I should have been asking where it was supposed to go. That evening, I started building a timeline. Every insurance payment Emily had highlighted. Every settlement. Every reimbursement. Every missing accounting entry. One by one. I wrote them on a whiteboard I'd kept in my office for home projects. 3 hours later, something finally caught my attention. Not the amounts. The dates. Nearly every missing payment had disappeared within 48 hours of being received. Not weeks. Not months. 48 hours. Almost like someone had made it a rule. That wasn't random. That was procedure. I opened another spreadsheet. Then another. Midnight came and went. By almost 2 in the morning, I found it. A payment from 8 years earlier. PKR 28 million equivalent in US dollars after an insurance settlement. According to the accounting records, the money arrived, then disappeared the next day. But unlike the others, someone had forgotten to remove one internal reference number. Just one. It looked insignificant. She looked past me toward Susan, then quietly said, "No, I know why Richard hoped you never would." She invited us inside. Tea arrived before questions. She never appeared rushed. Finally, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "You've seen the missing insurance payments." "Yes. And now you think Richard stole the money." "I don't know what to think." She nodded. "Good. Because if you came here certain of anything, you would have already been wrong." I placed Emily's folder on the table. Margaret barely glanced at it. "I've seen all of this before. So tell me, where did the money go?" She looked out the window for several seconds. When she finally answered, her voice carried more sadness than fear. "It went exactly where Richard told it to." I frowned. "Then why hide it?" "Because if people knew, they would have stopped him." My heartbeat slowed. Stopped him. From what? Margaret stood and walked toward an old filing cabinet. After unlocking the bottom drawer, she removed a worn leather ledger. Not a dramatic secret file. Not classified documents. Just an old accounting ledger. She placed it gently in front of me. "Before you accuse Richard Collins of stealing, read the names on the first page." I opened the cover. The first line wasn't a bank or an account number. It was a person's name. Then another. Then another. Dozens of names. Former employees. Current employees. Widows. Children. Beside every name was an amount of money. None of them matched the insurance records. I looked up in confusion. Margaret quietly said, "Those aren't missing payments, Michael. Those are people Richard never wanted anyone to know he was helping." The room fell silent. Because for the first time since the company closed, the numbers were finally beginning to tell a completely different story. There is something dangerous about believing you finally found the answer. Because that's usually the exact moment the truth changes again. I closed the leather ledger and looked across the table at Margaret Ellis. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. If Richard was helping these people, why hide it from everyone? Margaret let out a slow breath. Because Richard believed charity stops being charity the moment it becomes reputation. I frowned. That can't explain millions of dollars. No, it doesn't. It only explains why nobody knew. She rested both hands on the table. The rest is much harder. She opened the ledger again. This woman. She pointed to the first name. Angela Morris. Her husband died on the factory floor 15 years ago. I remembered him immediately. Frank Morris. A maintenance supervisor. Heart attack. Collapsed during a night shift. Good man. Hard worker. The company had paid the funeral expenses. Richard had attended the service himself. What about her? The insurance company refused to pay because they claimed Frank had hidden a heart condition. I looked up. I never heard that. Nobody did. Richard spent 3 years fighting them. And when he lost, he quietly supported Angela until her youngest daughter graduated from college. She turned another page. No press releases. No tax deduction speeches. No company newsletter. Just monthly payments. Every month. For 11 years. She pointed to another name. Samuel Ortiz. I smiled faintly. Toolmaker. Retired before me. Margaret nodded. Not exactly. I looked at her. What do you mean? He didn't retire. He developed Parkinson's. The insurance carrier rejected long-term disability. So Richard created a consulting contract. He kept paying Samuel's salary. On paper, Samuel was advising the company. In reality, he hadn't stepped inside the building in 4 years. I sat back. I remembered wondering why Samuel's employee number had remained active long after he'd supposedly retired. Nobody had questioned it. Richard had simply said, "Leave it alone." We had point one story became another. Then another. Then another. A machinist whose wife needed a liver transplant. A receptionist raising 3 grandchildren after her daughter died. An engineer whose son required lifelong rehabilitation after a drunk driving accident. Every story ended the same way. Insurance refused. Richard paid. Quietly. Personally. Without telling anyone. I looked around Margaret's small living room. Nothing expensive. Nothing extravagant. No evidence of stolen millions. Just old furniture. Family photographs. A bookshelf filled with legal textbooks. The house of someone who'd lived honestly. So why? Why destroy an entire company? Margaret must have seen the question on my face. You're still thinking about the missing money. I nodded. She slowly closed the ledger. Michael, do you know why Richard trusted me for 30 years? No. Because I argued with him. That surprised me. He hated people who agreed with him. She smiled. I spent half my career telling him he was making terrible decisions. And was he? Sometimes. But never for himself. She stood and walked toward the window. When the insurance companies refused legitimate claims, Richard stopped believing the system worked. So he started fixing it himself. I frowned. Using company money? She didn't answer immediately. Finally. Yes. The room became quiet. So it was embezzlement. No. It was unauthorized. There's a difference. I almost laughed. Try explaining that to a judge. I did. I looked up sharply. What? She turned toward me. I warned him. Again and again. Richard, if anyone ever audits these accounts, they'll think you've stolen everything. And what did he say? She smiled sadly. The same thing every single time. I'd rather lose my company than watch another employee lose their home. Those words stayed with me. Not because they proved Richard was innocent. They didn't. He had still moved company funds without approval. He had hidden transactions. He had falsified accounting records. Those things were wrong. There was no escaping that. But intent matters. Greed and sacrifice can sometimes leave exactly the same trail on paper. Only the reason is different. Susan had been unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. If that's true, why not tell the board? Margaret gave a tired smile. Because the board would have stopped him. And legally. They would have been right. She walked back to the table. Richard believed rules should protect people. When they stopped protecting people, he stopped following them. I rubbed my temples. The story was becoming clearer. But one piece still refused to fit. The investigators. Margaret's expression changed immediately. Yes, they weren't investigating insurance fraud. They were investigating missing corporate funds. Exactly. So Richard shut the company down. Because he knew they'd eventually find everything. Margaret nodded. But that still isn't the real reason. I stared at her. There's more. There always is. She reached into the same filing cabinet one final time. This time, she removed a thin manila envelope. Unlike the flash drive. Unlike Emily's folder. Unlike the old ledger. This one had only a single handwritten sentence across the front. Open only if Richard refuses to tell the truth. She placed it carefully between us. He gave me this almost 6 years ago. He told me to destroy it if nothing ever happened. I couldn't. You've earned the right to read it. I slowly reached for the envelope. Then stopped. What's inside? Margaret looked directly into my eyes. Her voice was almost a whisper. The one decision Richard made, that even I could never defend. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid of discovering another financial secret. I was afraid of discovering what kind of man Richard Collins really was. There are some secrets that destroy people the moment they're spoken aloud. Not because they're evil, but because once they're known, there is no way to undo them. I stared at the manila envelope resting between Margaret and me. Across the front, Richard's familiar handwriting read, "Open only if Richard refuses to tell the truth." For the first time since this began, I didn't want another answer. Every answer so far had cost me something. First my job, then my certainty, then the image I'd carried of Richard Collins for more than 30 years. I wasn't sure how much was left to lose. Margaret didn't rush me. She simply waited. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside were only 3 things: a handwritten letter, a board meeting transcript, and a resignation letter. I frowned. No hidden bank accounts. No dramatic confession. Just ordinary documents. Sometimes, the most ordinary papers change everything. I unfolded Richard's letter first. It was dated almost 6 years earlier. Not yesterday. Not last week. 6 years. It began simply, "Margaret, if you're reading this, then I've failed. Either I found the courage to tell everyone myself, or someone else forced the truth into the open." I kept reading. "For years I've done things that violated company policy. Some people will call it theft. Others will call it compassion. Neither description tells the whole story." That sounded exactly like Richard. Never trying to sound like a hero. Never pretending he'd done nothing wrong. Then one paragraph stopped me cold. "The money isn't what keeps me awake at night. It's the one decision I made because I was afraid." I slowly lowered the letter. Afraid? Richard Collins? In 32 years, I'd never once seen fear in that man. I reached for the board transcript. The meeting had taken place almost 6 years earlier. Attendance: Richard Collins. For board members: Margaret Ellis, Chief Financial Officer David Lawson. The discussion began exactly where I'd expected. Questions about unauthorized company spending, growing insurance costs, missing reserve funds. Several board members demanded immediate explanations. Richard admitted everything. Every undocumented payment. Every private agreement. Every dollar. Then the transcript recorded something unexpected. One board member asked, "How much of this can be recovered?" Richard answered immediately, "None of it." Another director said, "Then we'll have to dismiss every employee who received unauthorized assistance." I froze. Dismiss them? Margaret quietly watched me continue reading. The transcript became more heated. The board argued those employees had unknowingly received benefits outside company policy. Keeping them employed would expose the company to lawsuits, insurance fraud investigations, shareholder claims, government penalties. The recommendation was simple: terminate every affected employee. Immediately, I looked up. "How many?" Margaret answered softly. 73. 73 families. Not 1. Not 2. 73. I remembered many of those names. Samuel. Angela. Bill. People who'd spent decades working honestly. They hadn't asked Richard to hide anything. Most probably never knew he had. Yet the board wanted them fired. To protect the company. I returned to the transcript. Richard's response had been written word for word. "If anyone leaves this company because of my decisions, it will be me." Silence followed in the minutes. Then another board member proposed reporting Richard to federal authorities. The vote was postponed. The meeting ended without a resolution. I looked toward Margaret. "What happened afterward?" "He resigned." I blinked. "What?" He placed his resignation on the table. I grabbed the final document. The resignation letter. It was signed. Dated. Ready to become effective that same day. My eyes moved to the bottom of the page. Across the signature, someone had written one word in blue ink. Rejected. The board wouldn't accept it? I asked. Margaret slowly shook her head. They wanted something else. What? They wanted Richard to reverse every payment. I frowned. That would have been impossible. It was. The money had already paid mortgages, medical bills, college tuition, funeral expenses. It was gone. The room fell silent. For the first time, I began to understand why Richard had looked so exhausted during that final meeting. He wasn't watching a company collapse. He was watching 30 years of decisions catch up with him all at once. Not because he'd become greedy, because he'd convinced himself he could quietly solve problems no one else wanted to solve. And eventually, the truth always collects its debt. I folded the letter carefully. One question still remained. If the board knew 6 years ago, why did the company stay open? Margaret's expression darkened. Because Richard made them another promise. What promise? That he'd personally repay every unauthorized dollar. I stared at her. Every dollar? She nodded. He sold investment properties, mortgaged his vacation home, liquidated retirement accounts. For 6 years, he quietly paid the company back. I thought about the modest house, the old car Richard drove, the vacations he never took anymore. We'd all joked that he was the richest man who lived like a schoolteacher. Now, it wasn't funny anymore. But that doesn't explain yesterday, I said. If he'd been paying everything back, why close the company now? Margaret walked to the window. Without turning around, she answered. Because last week, the board voted. I felt my stomach tighten. They gave Richard one final choice. She looked back at me. Confess everything publicly. Name every employee who received unauthorized assistance. Recover whatever money he could. And save the company. I already knew his answer. He refused. Margaret nodded. He said those people had already suffered enough. So instead, he chose to let the company. But that doesn't explain yesterday, I said. If he'd been paying everything back, why close the company now? Margaret walked to the window. Without turning around, she answered. Because last week, the board voted. I felt my stomach tighten. They gave Richard one final choice. She looked back at me. Confess everything publicly. Name every employee who received unauthorized assistance. Recover whatever money he could. And save the company. I already knew his answer. He refused. Margaret nodded. He said those people had already suffered enough. So instead, he chose to let the company die. The words settled heavily between us. An entire company. 300 jobs. A lifetime of work. Gone. Because one man refused to expose 73 families who had done nothing wrong. I wanted to admire him. I wanted to condemn him. The truth was, I couldn't decide. As Susan and I prepared to leave, Margaret walked me to the front door. Just before I stepped outside, she quietly said, Michael, there's one thing I've never understood. The words settled heavily between us. An entire company. 300 jobs. A lifetime of work. Gone. Because one man refused to expose 73 families who had done nothing wrong. I wanted to admire him. What? She looked toward the envelope still sitting on her table. Richard always insisted there was one payment. He wished he'd never made. I frowned. What payment? I don't know. He never told me. But whatever it was, it wasn't made for an employee. She held my gaze. And that's the decision. That destroyed everything. The drive home was silent. Not because we had no questions left, but because, for the first time, the biggest mystery was no longer where the money had gone. It was who Richard had risked everything to protect. Some truths don't hide in what people tell you. They hide in what they refuse to say. For 3 days, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret's final words. There was one payment Richard always regretted. Not the 73 employees. Not the insurance claims. Not the missing company funds. One payment. One person. One decision. According to Margaret, that single choice had destroyed everything. I kept asking myself the same question. Who could possibly matter so much that Richard Collins would sacrifice an entire company to protect them? The following Monday, I drove past Collins Manufacturing for the first time since it had closed. The parking lot was empty. The loading docks were silent. The company flag had already been taken down. Only a few maintenance workers remained inside, preparing the building for liquidation. 32 years of memories, reduced to an empty shell. As I sat in my truck, I noticed someone standing near the employee entrance. Tom Henderson. He hadn't seen me. He was simply staring at the building, hands in his pockets, like a man saying goodbye to an old friend. I walked over. Tom. He turned slowly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Never thought we'd meet here again. Neither had I. We found a bench across the street. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Retirement. Grandchildren. The fishing trip we'd postponed for nearly 10 years. Neither of us mentioned Richard. Until Tom finally did. People are saying he stole from us. I looked at him. They're saying a lot of things. Tom nodded. Most of them aren't true. That caught my attention. What do you know? He stared at the abandoned factory. Not enough. But more than most. Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out an old envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. I almost threw this away years ago. He handed it to me. Inside was a short handwritten note. It was unmistakably Richard's handwriting. Tom. This isn't charity. It's simply time for the company to stand beside someone who's always stood beside it. Someday I hope you'll forgive me for the way I had to do this. Richard. Folded behind the note was a cashier's check. Never cashed. I frowned. You never used it? Tom slowly shook his head. I gave it back. Why? Because I found out where it came from. He looked down at his hands. My wife was sick. Cancer. The insurance company refused to cover part of her treatment. I didn't tell anyone. I remembered. His wife had been ill. But none of us had known how serious it was. One day Richard called me into his office. He handed me that check. Said it was an emergency employee assistance fund. I already knew where this was going. There wasn't any fund. Tom smiled sadly. No. It was company money. I found out 2 weeks later. So I returned it. What did Richard say? Tom laughed quietly. He got angry. Really angry. He told me if I ever refused help again, he'd fire me himself. For the first time in days. I smiled. That sounded exactly like Richard. But that's not why I'm here today, Tom said. His expression became serious again. The week before the company closed, Richard asked me a strange question. What was it? He asked whether I'd ever heard the name. Tom paused, as if saying it still felt wrong. Daniel Brooks. The name meant nothing to me. No. I told him I'd never heard it. He looked relieved. Then Tom looked directly at me. But he shouldn't have been. Why? Because I had. Every muscle in my body tightened. When? Years ago. One afternoon, I walked into Richard's office without knocking. He was arguing with someone. I only heard one sentence. Tom closed his eyes, trying to remember it exactly. Finally, he repeated it. If Daniel Brooks ever finds out the truth, everything we've built disappears. I stared at him. Did you ever ask Richard who Daniel was? Tom nodded. He told me to forget I'd heard the name. And I did. Until last week. Daniel Brooks. The name echoed in my mind. Emily Brooks. I suddenly sat forward. Brooks. The same. Surname. Maybe coincidence. Maybe not. I thanked Tom and drove home faster than I should have. Susan met me at the door. You look like you've seen a ghost. I think I found the first real lead. I told her everything. She listened quietly. Then she asked the question I'd somehow missed. Have you ever asked Emily about her family? I stopped. No, I hadn't. I picked up my phone immediately. Emily answered on the second ring. Michael, I need to ask you something. What? Who is Daniel Brooks? Silence. Not 1 second. Not 5. Almost 20. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Who told you that name? Does it matter? Yes. It matters more than anything. I told her about Tom. About the conversation. About Richard's office. Emily didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she quietly said, I was hoping you'd never hear that name. My heartbeat quickened. Why? Another long silence. Then, my father was Daniel Brooks. The room seemed to shrink around me. Was. He died 12 years ago. I frowned. What did he have to do with Richard? Emily's breathing became uneven. Finally, she whispered the sentence that changed everything. My father wasn't one of the employees Richard was protecting. He was the man who gave Richard a reason to hide the truth in the first place. The call ended. Not because she hung up. Because someone knocked on her front door. And just before the line went dead, I heard a man's voice say only 4 words. "Miss Brooks, we need to talk." There are moments when you realize you've been asking the wrong question all along. For days, I'd been trying to understand where the money went. Then I tried to understand who Richard was protecting. Now, for the first time, I needed to understand why one man, Daniel Brooks, had haunted Richard Collins for more than a decade. Because whatever had happened between them, it had destroyed one family. And eventually, it had destroyed Richard's as well. Emily didn't answer any more calls that day, or the next. Every message I left went unanswered. I wasn't sure if she was avoiding me, or if she simply couldn't. The knock I'd heard before the line went dead refused to leave my mind. Who had come to her door? The investigators? The board? Or someone else entirely? I had no way of knowing. 2 mornings later, my phone finally rang. It was Emily. "I can meet." Her voice sounded exhausted. "When?" "Today. One condition." "What?" "No diners. No public places. I don't want anyone overhearing this." She asked me to meet at a small church on the edge of town. Not inside. In the quiet memorial garden behind it. It overlooked rows of old oak trees and a modest cemetery. When I arrived, Emily was already sitting on a wooden bench. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Dark circles beneath her eyes. Hair tied back carelessly. For the first time since we'd met, she looked less like an HR executive, and more like a daughter carrying something she'd been carrying far too long. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for disappearing. You don't owe me an apology." "I think I do." She looked toward the cemetery. "I should have told you about my father from the beginning." "Why didn't you?" "Because if I did, you would have judged Richard before you knew the whole story." That answer surprised me. Even now, she was trying to protect Richard. "My father wasn't a bad man," she began. "He was the company's chief financial officer." I stopped. "CFO?" She nodded. "He worked beside Richard for almost 20 years. I remembered the name from the board transcript. Daniel Lawson. Then I frowned. "No." The transcript listed David Lawson. Emily gave a sad smile. "That wasn't my father. It was the man who replaced him." My heartbeat slowed. "So Daniel Brooks left before all of this?" She nodded. 12 years ago. My father discovered something. "What?" She looked directly at me. The insurance company wasn't just denying claims. They had started rejecting legitimate cases because they knew most employees couldn't afford to fight back. I nodded slowly. Margaret had hinted at that. My father wanted to sue. And Richard. He wanted to help people immediately. So they argued. Constantly. Neither man was trying to hurt employees. They simply believed in different solutions. One believed in changing the system. The other believed in helping the people trapped inside it. Emily reached into her bag and handed me a thin notebook. This was my father's. It wasn't a diary. It was a work journal. Short entries. Dates. Meetings. Phone calls. Ideas. One page had been marked with a folded corner. I opened it. The entry was dated 12 years earlier. "Richard thinks we can keep saving families one case at a time. I keep telling him that's not a solution. One day someone will ask where the money came from." I turned the page. Another entry. 3 months later. "We had our worst argument today. I told him good intentions won't protect him forever. He said he already knows." The handwriting ended there. No dramatic confession. No hidden scandal. Just 2 friends. Slowly realizing they no longer agreed. "What happened next?" I asked. Emily's eyes filled with tears. "My father resigned." I blinked. "He walked away?" He believed staying would have made him part of something he couldn't defend. So why did Richard keep doing it? Because people kept needing help. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Emily whispered. "My father died 6 months later." I'm sorry. She nodded. So was Richard. What do you mean? He came to our house the night before the funeral. That caught my attention. He didn't come as the CEO. He came as my father's oldest friend. Emily looked toward the church. I was 23. I answered the door. Richard looked broken. He handed my mother an envelope. What was in it? I didn't know at the time. My mother never told me. But after she passed away, I found it. She reached into her bag again. This time, she handed me the envelope itself. It had been opened years ago. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Richard's handwriting. I unfolded it carefully. I should have listened to him sooner. He was right about almost everything. I kept believing I could carry this alone. Instead, I asked too many good people to carry it with me. No excuses. No attempt to rewrite history. Just regret. Real regret. I looked up. So why did the company really close? Emily answered without hesitation. Because once the investigators arrived, Richard finally accepted what my father had warned him about 12 years earlier. He couldn't protect both the company and the people. So he chose the people. The answer should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt heartbreaking. Richard hadn't been hiding greed. He'd been hiding pride. He believed he alone could fix a broken system. He wasn't evil. He wasn't innocent. He was simply a man who had spent too many years believing that doing the right thing secretly was somehow better than asking for help. And eventually, that belief destroyed everything he had spent a lifetime building. As we stood to leave, Emily stopped me. There's something else. I turned back. The investigators. They're recommending criminal charges. I nodded slowly. I figured they would. She shook her head. Not against Richard. I frowned. Then against who? Emily looked me straight in the eyes. The board. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The board. They knew about the unauthorized payments 6 years ago. They rejected Richard's resignation. They let him keep repaying the money. They protected themselves. And now, they're telling investigators they knew nothing. She took a slow breath. They're trying to make Richard carry everything alone. I stood there in silence. Because suddenly, the story wasn't about one man's mistakes anymore. It was about the people who had quietly watched those mistakes grow, until there was no one left to blame but him. And for the first time, I realized Richard Collins hadn't lost everything the day he fired us. He had started losing everything the day no one was willing to stand beside him. There is a strange silence that follows the end of every storm. Not relief. Not happiness. Just the quiet realization that life will never return to the way it was before. For weeks after my conversation with Emily, the story of Collins manufacturing spread across the state. Newspapers called it corporate fraud. Television stations called it one of the biggest financial scandals in local business history. Former employees argued online. Some defended Richard. Others condemned him. Everyone seemed certain they finally knew the truth. I had read enough by then to understand something very different. Most people only knew pieces of it. The criminal investigation continued. The board members who had spent years insisting they knew nothing suddenly found themselves explaining meeting minutes, emails, financial reports, and votes they'd hoped everyone had forgotten. The investigators weren't interested in public statements. They wanted records. And records rarely cared about reputations. Several directors resigned before formal hearings even began. Others hired expensive attorneys. For the first time in years, Richard wasn't the only person answering difficult questions. As for Richard, he disappeared. Not literally. He simply withdrew from public life. His house went up for sale. His office was emptied. No interviews. No statements. No attempt to defend himself. People interpreted that silence as guilt. I wasn't so sure anymore. Sometimes, silence is simply exhaustion. One afternoon, nearly 3 months after the company closed, my phone rang. It was Margaret. He's ready. I knew exactly who she meant. Richard asked to meet at the factory. One last time. The building had already been sold. The machines were being removed. The familiar smell of oil and steel had almost disappeared. We walked through the empty production floor together. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, Richard stopped beside Assembly Line 3. I hired you over there. He pointed toward an old workbench. You were nervous. I was. You almost dropped your toolbox. I laughed to spite myself. I did. I pretended not to notice. For the first time in months. He smiled. I suppose you've read everything. I have. And? I looked around the empty building. I think you made good decisions. He looked surprised. And terrible ones. He nodded. That's fair. Richard rested one hand against an old support column. I never believed I was above the rules. I simply believed the rules had forgotten the people they were supposed to protect. I understood. I know. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking anyone whether I was still doing the right thing. That sentence struck me harder than anything else he'd said. Because it wasn't about accounting. Or insurance. Or investigations. It was about isolation. He had carried every decision alone. Until there was no one left willing to tell him he was wrong. I should have listened to Daniel. He said it quietly. Almost to himself. He wasn't telling me to stop helping people. He was telling me to stop carrying the burden by myself. Richard looked across the empty factory floor. I confused responsibility with control. I thought if I could solve every problem quietly, I'd spare everyone else the pain. Instead, he'd created a different kind of pain. One that eventually reached everyone. I owe you an apology. He turned toward me. For firing all of you. I shook my head. You don't owe me one. I lost a job. You lost your life's work. He smiled sadly. I deserved that. No. You deserved consequences. Not loneliness. For the first time, his eyes filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Just the kind that come when someone has spent too many years pretending to be stronger than they really are. We stood there for a long time. Neither of us trying to fix the past. Because some things cannot be repaired. Only accepted. As we walked toward the exit, Richard reached into his coat pocket. He handed me a small brass key. I frowned. What's this? My desk. They're auctioning everything next week. I'd rather one friend opened it than a stranger. A few days later, I unlocked Richard's old office for the last time. The room was almost empty. One desk. One chair. A bookshelf. Nothing more. The key opened the bottom drawer. Inside, there wasn't another secret file. No hidden fortune. No final confession. Only a worn notebook. On the first page, Richard had written a single sentence. A business is measured by its profits. A life is measured by the people who still stand beside you after the profits disappear. I closed the notebook slowly. When the liquidation auction ended, the machines were gone. The desks were gone. The company sign came down. But something unexpected happened. Former employees began meeting once a month. Not because anyone organized it. Because friendships built over decades refused to disappear with a paycheck. Tom always brought coffee. Angela baked pies. Samuel complained about fishing the way he'd always complained about work. For the first time, we weren't coworkers. We were simply people who had shared part of our lives together. And somehow, that mattered more. I never saw Richard again. Margaret told me he'd moved to a small town near the coast. No one there knew he'd once owned a manufacturing company. Or that he'd spent years trying to save people in ways both admirable and deeply flawed. Perhaps that was exactly what he wanted. A place where he could simply be an old man. Not a hero. Not a villain. Just a man who had learned too late that even the best intentions cannot survive forever in the shadows. Looking back now, people still ask me whether Richard Collins was a good man. I've stopped trying to answer. Because life rarely gives us people who are entirely good. Or entirely bad. It gives us people who make impossible choices. Then spend the rest of their lives living with them. If Richard taught me anything, it wasn't that rules don't matter. They do. It wasn't that compassion excuses dishonesty. It doesn't. He taught me something far more important. Never carry a burden so quietly that the people who love you never get the chance to help you carry it too. And if you ever become the person everyone depends on, make sure there's still someone in your life willing to tell you when you're wrong. Because sometimes, the people who save us are the ones who refuse to let us save the world alone.